one thing that could prove helpful kind of at a practical level is that you can think of your dissertation as joining into an existing conversation. That as you are looking at a certain topic, you're going to be reading primary sources, you're also going to be reading secondary sources. And as you're reading through those secondary sources, you're going to hear voices saying things that either resonate with you as being, useful or not. The more you assess those sources and the more you start to command those sources, the more you're going to recognize what would be significant, and what would be significant and what might be defensible. In other words, you will start, as you read the primary and secondary literature, you'll start to gain your voice, as it were, in that conversation. And you'll be able to kind of evaluate the state of the scholarship on this particular topic. And as you keep reading through it, you can say to yourself, maybe you don't hit the nail on the head on the German-American model, but you can say something like, you know what? I think there are several things that have not yet been said with sufficient clarity on this particular topic. And so you can discern what is significant and defensible as you try to join into that scholarly conversation and make a distinctive contribution. And if you'll let the people who have already written, you're looking at your primary sources, whatever they are, you're also looking at the secondary literature on it, whatever that is. And if you'll try to get as wide an exposure to that secondary literature, you'll recognize pretty clearly, A, what is significant, and B, what is defensible. It will come as you consistently visit that conversation, as you listen in on it. And I think it could help to keep you from doing what this English gentleman did, where you say, I have a wonderful survey of data which is unintelligible and meaningless. You don't ever want to say that. And if you're looking at the secondary sources, if you're looking at the secondary sources, you'll at least know, what you might be able to say in joining that scholarly conversation.
But what you want to do after you've begun, if you've begun to zero in generally on a topic and you're reading the secondary sources, you want, before you finally choose, and you got to fish or cut bait, when you make a final decision, you have got to master all of the secondary literature and make sure that no one's written a major article on this, or a book, or some dissertation in Timbuktu, or Joe Fundamentalist Seminary, or whatever. And so how do you do that? Well, first thing I tell my student, I have a student doing use of Jeremiah and Revelation. I have a student doing use of Old Testament and Philippians. And I said, before you even decide finally on those two topics, you're going to have to master everything that's been written back to about 1965. Because if you can do that, then if something was written before that was important, usually it's going to be in the footnotes or something of some of those sources you're going to pick up. But you've got to be very thorough. This is a beautiful place to start. But you've got to be thorough. What does that mean? You have to know the bibliographical sources. And if you don't know the following bibliographical sources to find out what's been written on your topic, you're walking on one research foot. And that is a Lincus Bibliographicus, New Testament abstracts, if you're in New Testament, Old Testament abstracts, Religion Index 1 and 2. If you don't know about those sources, you need to go to your professor or to the library and ask them about it. A Lincus Bibliographicus, New Testament or Old Testament abstracts, and Religion Index 1 and 2. That's going to be, there are others too, but that's going to give you sufficient coverage, and I'd go back to 1960. You open it up, and it'll go to, say, Philippians. Give you everything written on Philippians. And you get your computer, just typing away. And there's always a possibility you might miss something. But once you do that, that becomes part of the proposal of your dissertation and the introduction to your dissertation. You're surveying the field. You've gotten the general landscape, but then you fill it out with this bibliographical search, and you say, well, here's what's been done on this topic. So and so in the 1950s did this, in the 60s they did that, and so on and so on. But there's a gap. And this is what this dissertation is trying to do. The only way you can know what your contribution is going to be is to know the literature exhaustively.
I think that when you're writing a paper at the PhD level, just one practical thing to remember is after you get to your thesis and you feel like sufficiently, you've argued it sufficiently, you feel like you've come pretty close to doing a God-honoring job of proving the topic, the thesis that you're trying to prove, regardless of what it is. I think it's really useful then to start thinking of closing off tunnels of escape so that you try to make your thesis. I know this is maximizing cogency, that's getting close to this, and I know these are distinct topics, but I think if you really practice anticipating the objections that are going to come to your thesis, it will force you to do what Dr. Bill's saying about getting into that literature on your topic and making sure you're not missing not just a positive contribution where someone may have said what you're saying, but where someone has offered a devastating line of critique to what you're arguing and you're blissfully ignorant. That's not a good thing. So in your PhD papers, when you're writing something, do your very best to close off, tunnels of escape, or put a different way, anticipate objections. And the way you do that is try to hear, in the time you have, all of the voices, all of the significant voices that might be speaking to your topic and especially challenging your thesis. That'll get you in the habit of doing in a microcosm of a paper, of doing the things that you need to be doing more globally on the larger project of a dissertation.
And to be successful in the PhD dissertation, it really is, there's two things. It's discipline and sweat. You have to have a sufficient amount up here. But I know some geniuses that, well, sometimes they don't do well in doctoral work. Why? Because they don't have the sweat and the discipline. That's interesting. So, at any rate, if you have the sweat and the discipline, the other thing that you need is the vision of your topic. And that'll cause you to want to produce the sweat and the discipline. You've got to have a vision. This is what I want to write. It's a contribution to scholarship/church. And I say scholarship/church because we're not just writing for the academic guild. We're also writing for the church, and you want to combine those two. Some of you will go into ministry. Some of you will go into scholarship. But even those who go into scholarship, like Lane and I, we're ordained ministers, we're active in our churches, we preach, and so I think the model here is that of a scholar pastor.
I think it's a good practice to see if you can state your thesis in a single sentence. See if you can do it. And if you can't do it, don't write yet. Get your thesis into, it can be a compound, complex sentence, however, but not too Faulknerian, but a single sentence. If you can do that, you're probably going to be able, when you look at that thesis, to ask yourself the question, whether it's a paper or a dissertation, is that something I can prove in the allotted space? And if it's one of those, if it's a very, very broad thesis statement, that there's no way you can do it in 25 pages, or there's no way you can do it in a doctoral dissertation, then what you have to do for cogency's sake is narrow, narrow, narrow. You should be thinking in your papers and in your dissertation, narrow. I think the general maxim is narrow is better. The more narrow it becomes, the more manageable it becomes. And so I think narrowing, getting a single sentence thesis and then asking yourself, is that sufficiently narrow? Then, just in terms of like the structure of what I consider to be a good paper or dissertation, is ask yourself, how does each section in the paper subserve and prove your thesis? If it does not do it, you don't need it. It might be really interesting information, and it might be fascinating for people who are reading it, but if it's not serving the purpose of proving your thesis or giving evidence that supports your thesis, you don't need it in there. And so you want to see a good paper as a microcosm of a good dissertation. In your dissertation, every single chapter is going to have its own contribution to the overall thesis that you have. And readers know this intuitively. People who are trained can spell it out. People who aren't trained can't spell it out, but they know it. It's the pace of your dissertation or the pace of your paper. If it's meandering and is not focused, it's not going to be as cogent. It's not going to be as persuasive. People's minds are going to wonder, and they're going to say, why is he even talking about this? Why is she doing this? But if your paper, like your dissertation, if it has a thesis, and then you get the sense that every single paragraph is part of a larger, mosaic that's pushing you to see this thesis and to say, yeah, this is persuasive, then the cogency is going to be there. It comes from narrowing and then refining everything in either the paper or the dissertation. You have to ask yourself this question: how does this section in the paper or this section in the dissertation, how does it serve and elucidate and support my thesis? If you can't see the connection, I guarantee you your reader won't. Your reader just won't. So you've got to be asking that question, and cogency is going to come out when you refine single sentence thesis, narrow it properly, and then everything that you're doing in the paper or dissertation is supporting that thesis. That's when I think some cogency can start to come.